Personal stories, they are extremely powerful, I believe. And sometimes I'm hesitant to share my personal story because I think much many people had it much worse than me, but I've learned so much from other people's stories and I thought I'd share mine. I grew up with very kind-hearted, good parents. However, my mother's alcoholism had a tremendously negative impact on me growing up and throughout my adult years. And it started early on when I was about 4 or 5 years old. Those are my earliest memories. For the first 10 years or so of my life, my dad worked a lot to make ends meet. He worked often at night. And so my mom was kind of my primary caregiver. And I remember being 4 or 5 years old on like a particular Saturday where I woke up by myself and sat and watched the Saturday morning cartoons for hours. And then I sat and played by myself for hours. And I was hungry. And I was watching the kids across the street. It was a beautiful day outside and they were playing. And I wished that I could go out and play. But of course, I couldn't without my mother's permission. And she was still asleep and was asleep until late afternoon because she had been up drinking so much and was hungover. So I remember watching those kids across the street, and one of the boys saw me and he waved, and I dropped down below the window. I was so embarrassed because I knew then that he knew how much I wanted to go outside, and I feared that he thought it was strange that we were really never outside enjoying the nice weather, and my mother kept us a bit isolated. So I also remember I went to school at a small Catholic school about 15 minutes away, so I was outside of the busing limit, so my mom had to drive me to school every day. And it was often quite a process just to get to school, where I would wake up by myself and make myself breakfast and get ready for school, and then I would have to allow for time to beg and plead for my mom to get out of bed because she was so hungover. And then I would often be running into the building at school as the bell was ringing, and I was nervous and stressed because I didn't like to be tardy. I liked to follow the rules and keep things in order. And from those early years, I was, 8 or 9 years old, I was very much a mini adult. I followed all the rules, got good grades. I was extremely shy at school, but I tried to be as perfect as I could. And I knew that my mother's behavior wasn't good. I was very confused by her behavior, where one minute, I was an only child at that time. I got a lot of attention, and she was very loving. And then the next minute, when she was drinking, she would get aggressive and loud and say extremely cruel things to me. And I couldn't distinguish between those words. Did she truly love me? And if she did, why wouldn't she stop drinking when I begged through tears and pleaded with her to stop drinking? And that she promised thousands of times that she would, but she never did. And I just always kept believing that it was tied to me, that in some way I was causing her to drink, that maybe I was a burden on her or I wasn't good enough. And so I always believed that if I could just convince her that her love for me was strong enough or she didn't need to do that anymore, then she wouldn't. And so it was just constantly this focus on that. And I don't think my mom's family or my dad's family really knew how much my mom's drinking was affecting me or how bad it had gotten. They knew that she had problems with drinking, but drinking problems were pretty much a widespread problem throughout both sides of my family. So they were dealing with their own issues and maybe not aware of how bad it was for me. So it went on as the family secret, the intermediate family secret. And I talked to my dad about it sometimes, and he would always reinforce this idea of it being this Jekyll and Hyde situation, that my mom at heart is an extremely good person, and she is very compassionate and kind, but that she wakes up every day with this weight on her shoulders, this burden that is alcoholism. And my father was a great man and very optimistic and really just always believed that it would somehow get better. I think he was living in codependency. extremely codependent on my mom, and just didn't realize maybe how much it was affecting me, that I was going to school with not enough sleep, that I went to bed without enough to eat at night, that I was very hungry going to bed some days because my mom would send me to bed early so that she could start drinking, or the drinking was keeping me up because her behavior was so crazy. And she was never extremely physically abusive to me, like is a very common story with kids of alcoholics, but there was neglect going on. I was constantly nervous that she was going to burn the house down because she would drop her burning cigarettes on the couch, other carpet. I mean, there were holes everywhere from that. She would leave the things cooking on the stove and pass out. I just always had this fear that something terrible was going to happen, and often it did. And over the years, things just progressively worsened. But my family and people at school never saw any hint of real problems of how it was affecting me. I, again, was very good at hiding it and figuratively and literally cleaning up the messes from my mom. And I remember in the 5th grade, even my teacher saying, "Jody, you have such a wonderful, perfect mom." And she was a wonderful person and is a wonderful person. But the effects of her alcoholism were so terrible on all of us. And so this just continued on. I had a very lonely childhood, I would say, and I always wanted a brother or a sister. And my mom had some miscarriages, and it was always very devastating because I wanted to have a sibling to experience life with, maybe to be a more stable person. So when I was just turned 14 years old, my sister Brooke was born, and I was a bit old at that time to really care about having a sibling, but I was happy nonetheless to have somebody else in this world to live with. And there were complications in the delivery that threatened my mom's life and Brooke's life. And in the commotion of it, I was the first person to hold Brooke when she was born. And looking back on that, I think that really kind of foreshadowed our relationship, my role in her life. So I was very, very hopeful, I think, my whole life, but in particular when Brooke was born, that would be enough to snap my mom out of it, to like fix her, that maybe she needed a sense of completeness. Maybe this baby would give her something that I couldn't. Again, those feelings of not being good enough. And for my sister's first few years, she did okay, but I was in high school at that time, and I started to feel really frustrated and resentful to my mom that she put us through what she did. I have terrible, terrible memories and good memories, but a lot of terrible memories of just ruined holidays. Christmas Eve was never good. My mom was always wasted. And when she drank, she became a totally different person. And if you met her, you would think, oh, what a sweet and kind person. And that's who she really is. But when she has just even a few beers in her, she becomes the opposite, where she's unrecognizable. She is loud and totally aggressive and angry, just so angry. And she would scream on the top of her lungs at me and at my dad about trivial things or things that had nothing to do with us, just like totally crazy, wacky behavior. And it would go on for hours, and she would stumble around and just say the cruelest, meanest things that you could ever think to say, and throw stuff across the room and hit my father. And just total crazy. Police came to the house a few times that she had DUIs. It was an extreme alcoholism situation that went on. So back to high school, things were getting a little bit better now that Brooke was around. Brooke was a toddler, but I was very frustrated that my mom was still drinking, that I couldn't convince her, that my tearful letters or tearful pleading to her, or letters that I would slip under her bedroom door and she would just throw away and barely acknowledge, weren't working. And it was hurtful, and I was angry at her. And around that time, I started getting closer with my dad. He was super involved in my cross country and track. I was, unlike grade school, involved in high school, and we got closer. And I started to understand him better. about why he didn't divorce my mom or take action. He was so ill himself, and he truly believed, as he told my sister and me, that if he divorced my mom or took some action, that she would die. And he couldn't bear that thought, and he was just trapped in this codependency and this world that we had. And I think he just dealt with it as best he knew. He didn't go to Al-Anon meetings, he didn't get educated, and to this day, I think maybe he would be alive today if he didn't go through the decades of extreme stress and abuse from my mom. So I was nearing high school graduation, and my father was worried because I was so worried. I didn't want to leave my sister behind. I was very worried about how things would go with my mom without me being there, because again, I was keeping everything together, being the adult of the house, and I was extremely concerned about how things would go without me being there when I went away to college. But my dad assured me that things were getting better, and they seemed to be, and that I would always regret not pursuing this path and going to the college that I really wanted to. So I went off to college, and something very interesting happened. I went from being this, total rule follower, kind of a goody two-shoes, to having a relationship with alcohol, where I would do the social, go to the parties thing, and I really liked the way that alcohol seemed to erase my insecurities, that I had all these issues kind of going on inside that came to the surface, and self-confidence, trust, a whole lot of self-confidence issues going on. And I could walk into parties then with alcohol in my system and not have any of that baggage. I was free from it, and I really enjoyed that feeling. And so over the course of that first year in college, I started to rely on that. And then I looked closely at myself. I was sort of on this slippery slope. Like, I could see how my mother and other alcoholics in my family started to develop that relationship, where I couldn't really go to barbecues and other places where I didn't know people without already having alcohol in my system. So unlike my friends who just did kind of the typical college partying, I was developing this close relationship with it. I didn't like that feeling. So after roughly about 2 years of college, I stopped heavy drinking, and I started focusing on my education and building a foundation for my career and paying more attention to what was going on at home. And things were slipping with my mom, and I discovered that, like me, my sister was being neglected by my mom. She was also being verbally abusive, and a lot of terrible things were going on, like my mom would go for a day or so locked in her room and not come out, leaving my sister alone. Or worse, she would take off to the store and leaving her home alone, or worse, drive her in the car. And, there's drinking and driving stuff going on that just should not be going on. None of it should be going on. So I basically took on the full adult role again and commuted back and forth between classes and work and home, and was a really stable figure in my sister's life because I knew that she needed me. My father at that time was working a lot again and at night, so he wasn't able to be that stable figure, and so that became me. So I was balancing everything. In fact, sometimes I would bring Brooke to stay with me at my apartment near campus, which, looking back, a Big Ten campus apartment is not a place for a 7-year-old, but that was a safer, better environment than at home, which shows like the dysfunction of it. So I graduated and took a full-time job, and at that time I seriously considered trying to get custody of my sister, but I was so worried that it would devastate my dad, and my dad just kept believing that things would get better. And so I spent a lot of time commuting from near where I worked back home and going to all my sister's school functions and sporting events, and trying to hold the pieces together. And it was extremely stressful and difficult, and affected my boyfriend. I lost a boyfriend over the matter, and it just became way too much for someone in their early 20s like that. And so then after a while, I moved back home. I spent a few years at home, and we just kind of lived in this chaos. My mom on this roller coaster of really bad drinking bouts and DUIs were then court-ordered treatment, and just always this hope and then the disappointment. She was never engaged in wanting to get help for herself. So that's just how it went on for a while. And then I was 26 years old and I hit this wall where I was so miserable. I didn't think that my life was anything close to what I had wanted it to be when I was a kid, when I dreamed of what life would be like with this like freedom. And I was so depressed that I didn't even think that I wanted to go on. I mean, it was really seriously that bad. But I would never seriously consider leaving this world because too many people depended on me. My sister needed me, and I wanted to be there for her. And so I had to find a way out of this sense of entrapment. So I finally, after 26 years of dealing with my mom's alcoholism, started to get educated about it. And I read all these books and started going to Al-Anon meetings and listening to other people's stories. And it was a variation of my story, and opening my eyes to a lot of the things that I battled, like extreme anxiety and self-confidence and trust and never feeling satisfied with myself, all really directly stemmed from my experience growing up with my mom. And I will say that I love my mom tremendously, and every single day I pray for her and I worry for her, and I wish that I could take her disease and what she deals with every day and put it on me so that she could be free from that. It's extremely painful to watch someone you love go through this. However, I will always feel saddened by the fact that my mom could never get to the point, and still isn't, at the point where she wants to get help. But finally, I started, after education, letting go of that sense of responsibility and focusing more on myself and self-care. And I was still super involved in my sister's life, but I, had my own apartment and I started to build my own life in addition to being so involved in my sister's life. So things were getting better. My education and focusing more on myself was improving my relationship with my mother. We all seem to get better from that, from one person in the family kind of stepping out and learning what the hell is going on here. So things got better. And then a few years ago, my father died suddenly from a heart attack. And it was super devastating. He was a great man. He impacted thousands of people's lives. He was a talented coach and athlete and wonderful person and very good father in many ways. He was never able to perhaps handle the situation the way that it should have been, but he was a very good man. So my father dies, and my first thought is, this tremendous punch in the gut of sadness of losing your father. And then the second thought was, which was perhaps even more painful, now I'm 100% responsible for my mother. And that was more overwhelming than I can even describe in words. And I promptly, within a few weeks' time, moved out of my place, moved back into my parents' home, because all I could think was, I have to be here for my sister. I have to be here for my mom. I have to become my dad and more. I had to try to handle everything, but then not really handle everything the way that my dad did, enabling situations to go on. So I, in some way, I think, hoped that this was rock bottom for my mom, that perhaps the grief would lead her to get the help that she so desperately needed. And so, 30 years, I was still holding on to this hope about my mom getting fixed. So, of course, my mom, just totally overwhelmed with grief, just plummeted. I mean, days of binge drinking. I was terrified every day. I went to work just with sickness in my stomach, worried that my mom was going to drink and drive and kill herself or kill some innocent person, that she would burn the house down. Just the same feelings I had as a kid, back. It went on for 3 months. Basically didn't sleep. I thought, this is the rest of my life. And it sounds crazy. Outsiders, you might think, why would you even put yourself in that situation? But I spent my entire life knowing only that I was the grown-up, that I was like the parent, the roles reversed. I had to take care of this distraught person who's ill. And my sister had a year of high school left. She was so devastated by the loss of our father, as I was. And after about 3 months, I realized, and my sister realized, we could not live in that environment. It was toxic. Um, and so we moved out. And I remember the day when I came to pick up the last bit of stuff, I just sobbed because I truly felt like I was abandoning a sick child. That's how it felt. And you can imagine how heart-wrenching that would be. I was so fearful that she would die and that I was like leaving her there to die, even though I had tried for 30 some years and couldn't convince her to get help. So it was very hard. But then an interesting thing happened. A few weeks passed and the clarity started hitting my brain. I remembered everything that I had learned about codependency and self-care, and I started to get better and focused on healing from the grief of losing my father, and the same for my sister. It was still a very difficult time, but we started to get better. And you know what? My mom did too, that she suddenly had to stand on her feet as a grown-up more than she ever had in her entire life, because my father enabled her to live this sheltered life where she could be an alcoholic. She could live that way. And then I took that role too, but she couldn't do that anymore because she had to survive on her own for the first time in her life. And so she started to get better. Now she's still an alcoholic, but I'm happy to say today she's doing better than I ever could have imagined her doing. And I'm doing much better. My sister's in college. She's doing great. She's happy and healthy. Now I'm a work in progress, but I'm doing so much better and relying on what I've learned. But it's definitely a journey. And that's why I enjoy hearing other people's stories so much, because I think you can learn so much from them. And so I thought it was important to share my story and continue to share bits and pieces of my story. But I encourage people who experienced these kinds of things, traumatic things growing up, whether it was growing up with an alcoholic parent or two, or some other dysfunctional, abusive situation, to talk about it. And you never know who it's going to impact. There could just be one nugget of a piece of your story that helps someone else. The second is, if you suspect that there is alcoholism going on in a home, it's probably significantly worse than what you've even seen. So, and I think there's this kind of, oh, it's their business, like you don't want to get involved. But somebody needs to, because this is way too common. I mean, there's 1 in 4 kids or 1 in 5 kids is growing up in an alcoholic household or any other kind of addiction that we have going on today. And so it's extremely important for people to just simply say, hey, I'm here for you if you need someone, and be that person who could be called on if the help is needed. And for kids of alcoholics, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to get educated about what addiction is and what alcoholism is, to understand what the hell is going on, and that it's not your fault, that you can't possibly cause or control someone's drinking, and that your sole job in life is to take care of yourself. And it has taken me my entire life, and I don't want other people to end up with a life like mine, that I spent obsessed with my mom and dealing with issues caused by her alcoholism. And it's important to just focus on taking care of yourself, because that's your job in life. And sometimes that means then, which is extremely scary, reaching out for help and telling another family member or someone you trust about what's going on at home, because that's your job, to take good care of yourself. And you deserve safety and serenity, and scary things, sometimes steps have to be taken in order to take good care of yourself. So again, I hope you share your story and that you take good care of yourself.